Okay, so I guess we're right about ready to start. This is the third and final day of our conference. My name is Patrick. Diana will be moderating today. We are both PhD students at the Center for Ethics, a study in human value, University of Pardubice, Czech Republic, and our conference, Looking Forward in Hope and Despair, Critical Perspectives on Utopia and Dystopia, Philosophy, and the Arts. Diana?
Okay, I welcome everyone who's here, and I'm very much looking forward in much hope to Yunjie's talk right now. The screen is yours. Thank you.
And thanks for coming, everyone. I think it is important when thinking about utopia to consider animals and other non-animated life forms, not just humans. So I believe other animal ethics and environmental ethics will basically agree with me too. The topic of my presentation today is about relational value in animal ethics and environmental ethics. Let me share my screen with you guys. Yeah, no problem. Okay. Can you see my screen, everybody?
Yes, yes.
Okay. So here's my outline. I will talk about 4 different parts today. First, I will introduce some background issues that how intrinsic value played such an important role in animal ethics and environmental ethics. Second, I want to emphasize the problems that when we're talking about animals or even nature has intrinsic value will bring. Third, I want to introduce another value theory, relational value, that is already being introduced and discussed in other non-philosophical fields. Fourth, I want to develop and clarify the idea of relational value in a philosophical account. Here is the picture of Tom Regan and his famous book, The Case of Animal Rights. Tom Regan is the first and the most popular person bring up the idea of intrinsic value, or use his words, inherent value of sentient animals. Here is a quotation from his book. For not wasting too much time, I will not read it, but you can read it yourself here. According to this quotation, Regan primarily focus was to identify the moral rights that animals have. He claims that animals are sensitive beings with a set of psychological capacities. Therefore, they possess a significant degree of subjectivity and have intrinsic or inherent value. The interpretation of intrinsic value here means viewing certain individuals, both moral agents and moral patients, as having values in themselves, and viewing certain individuals existing as ends in themselves. In light of the inherent value here, Regan further states that individuals who have inherent value or intrinsic value have a fundamental moral right to respectful treatment. Because if individuals have inherent value, then any principle that declares what treatment is due to them as a matter of justice must take their value into account. In environment ethics, there are 2 main major theories. One is anthropocentrism. The other is non-anthropocentrism. From perspective of anthropocentrism, the only reasons we have to solve environmental problems are based on humans' needs, interests, and preferences. However, from the perspective of non-anthropocentrism, the reasons to solve environmental problems are for the sake of the environment itself, rather than any human's interests or preferences. The differences between anthropocentrism and non-anthropocentrism is theory of value. According to anthropocentrism, only human beings have independent value. Other species and nature have value only insofar as they are good for human beings. That is, they are valuable only insofar as they satisfy humans' needs, desires, preferences, and interests. But the non-anthropocentrists believe that other species and the nature itself have their own values, which is independent of humans. In non-anthropocentrism, caring about the environment is not just a matter of the interests and preferences of humans, present or future. The environment has its own value and should be preserved on that basis alone. In other words, nature has value, which is independent of any instrumental usefulness for human purposes or preferences. But at the same time, I found out intrinsic value has some problems in animal ethics and environmental ethics. So here are the things I found out. I will explain to you now. So in animal ethics for Regan, only higher animals have this inherent value or intrinsic value. So so-called lower animals and plants have no intrinsic value, because he thinks that higher animals and sentient beings who have a good of their own, they have the same intrinsic value as humans. However, I argue that Regan's argument that higher animals have inherent value still implies a human-based value theory, and it can even be easily interpreted as saying that some animals have intrinsic value only because they share certain characteristics with humans. For example, they are conscious, they feel pain. Therefore, I argue that Regan's appeal to inherent value to justifying animals' moral standing fails to provide a basis for preserving the vast majority of species, and also fails to provide an adequate justification for preservation of non-sentient species and non-conscious species. Unlike intrinsic value in animal ethics, environment ethics actually have questioned whether only higher animals have intrinsic value and moral standing. Therefore, they give intrinsic value a larger scope. For example, they don't only focus on single individuals, nor certain type of individuals who may have same features as human beings. Environment ethics want to propose a theory of intrinsic value based on altruistic moral sentience and project it onto non-human barriers. The locus of value is not just a single individual, but in whole species, the biotic community, and includes even non-living elements such as soil, air, and water. For the intrinsic value in environment ethics, I argue that this intrinsic value will lead to two morally questionable issues. First, emphasizing the intrinsic value of species or biotic community may imply that although the single individual has intrinsic value, it is only because of their contribution to the whole community or bigger project. This may weaken or eliminate the view that the individuals have intrinsic value and are capable of being valuable for themselves. Second, it will always cause conflicts with animal ethics. For example, killing a certain amount of deers will always morally wrong according to the animal ethics. But killing a certain amount of deers for the flourishing and the balancing of the whole environment may morally acceptable according to environment ethics. So for the struggling that intrinsic value caused in animal ethics and in environmental ethics, I argue that we can sidestep these debates if we focus our attention to the relational value of nature and animals as opposed to thinking about whether they have intrinsic value. And of course, not just to me, other researchers already thought about it, write about it, and discussed about it. For example, the researchers from environmental science and the conservation policies area, I cited some references here. You can have a look. Also, these definitions have given me some understanding of a relational value, inspired me. But these definitions are not comprehensive and even have some ambiguous and confusing content. So my main purpose today is to propose a consistent type of value theory, which will not include the locus of non-human individuals, but also eliminate the conflicts between single individuals' value and the value of the whole of nature or biotic community. And here is my plan to develop and clarify relational value. I will elaborate the concept of relational value by answering 3 questions. First, what is value and what is relational value? Second, where can we find relational value? And third, what kind of relations have relational value? To understand what it is for something to have relational value, we must first have some idea of what it means for something to have value. To say that something has value is to say that it is fitting or appropriate to have a certain set of attitudes toward that thing. For example, if something has value, then it is fitting to respect, appreciate, admire, or love that thing. And moreover, to say that something has value is to say that that thing is a source of reason to act in certain ways. For example, to act so as to protect, conserve, or promote the thing. Applying this understanding of what it is to have value, we can see that some relationship or relations has value when it is fitting or appreciated to have a certain set of attitudes toward that relationship. For example, a relationship has value when it is fitting or to respect, appreciate, or admire that relationship. Moreover, that relationship will be a source of reasons to act in certain ways, like to protect, conserve, or to promote. And next, where to find a relational value is the second question that I want to discuss. Normally, when we say that A has some kind of value, A is like an object, then we can find that the features that A has are valuable, or A itself has this kind of value. So for example, when we say that a rare stamp has high economical value, we mean that this stamp itself is economically valuable, and also it's the stamp's property of being rare that is the main reason why the stamp has high economical value. And obviously, the economical value is located in the stamp, and more specifically located in the rarity of the stamp. Furthermore, when the stamp is torn, the economical value carried by the stamp disappears, or if more stamps are produced and the stamp is therefore no longer rare, then the economical value of the stamp will decrease. So the location of relational value of something seems to be more abstract. Relational value is based on relationships and connections between different individuals or groups. This means that relational value should also be located in the relationships and the connections rather than in any particular individual or group. Interestingly, I think maybe critics may think that we can consider that if we say, oh, A has relational value, then it might indicate that the relational value located in A is just like the stamp case. However, I argue that relational value is very different from most kinds of values like the previous economical value. It is a kind of value that exists only when two or more objects have a relationship. That is, this value is located in relationships. And let's take an example. If Aiden has a good friend and they understand and appreciate each other a lot, their friendship is very valuable. If one day Aiden's good friend dies, does their relationship, their friendship, and the relational value located in it disappear? Objectively speaking, I think because Aiden's friend as one of the relata no longer exists, their friendships no longer exists. Therefore, the relational value in the friendship no longer exists. However, people may still think that, oh, if Aiden cherishes the friendship very much and this friendship will play an important role, still plays an important role in his life, then the friendship might still exist for him. Does that mean the value on the friendship still exists? I argue that from the subjective view of Aiden, he can definitely believe that the friendship and its relational value still exists, even though his friend died. But however, this view relies on the idea that we can create value by valuing something, like we even can value a stone and value a piece of paper. That is kind of like subjective value, which is not a view I want to discuss here today. So I just wanted to mention to have this kind of like distinction. Because I still want to focus on the relational value in environment ethics, so I prefer to narrow the content of relational value only to human nature relations in this page. We say there are 4 types of nature relationships, like mastery over nature, stewardship of nature, partnership with nature, and a participation in nature. In the mastery over nature relationship, humans consider themselves as masters over nature and think that they can trample on nature as they wish and use nature as a pure resource. In the stewardship of nature relationship, humans are on the top of a hierarchy and have the responsibility to conserve the things created by God. In the partnership with nature relationship, humans and nature interact with each other and support each other. More importantly, this relation rejects a hierarchical relation between humans and nature and implies a sense of ecological egalitarianism. And finally, in the participation in nature relationship, humans are one kind of species in nature and participate in nature like other species. This relationship involves humans focusing on experience nature as a great whole and the feeling of connectedness. I understand this relation as one in which humans and the other species are all participants in nature. Also, different species play different roles in nature. There is no difference in the moral position of human and other species. And meanwhile, I argue that to be in this kind of relationship with nature means that humans see themselves as playing a certain role in nature as a whole. Are these 4 relationships value from a relational value perspective, or we can ask a similar question, which of these relationships has relational value? As I described in the previous context, relational value is a special kind of value which is only located in relationships, and this value benefits the relator. And simply put, a relationship has relational value means this relation should be good for both relator or can be judged good for all the relator. In the mastery over nature relationship, humans seem to take all of the advantages from the relationship and nature is not benefited at all. And therefore, I doubt that there is any relational value in this kind of relationship. For the steward of nature, I think that this relationship is questionable itself and has similar problem like the mastery over nature relationship. On the other hand, I argue that the relations like partnership with nature and participate in nature are both good relations with relational value. These 2 relations are built by human and nature together. The relational value are built by the relationship and benefits both of the relator. If we describe human and nature as having a partnership, then we may mean human and nature work together and need each other for a common goal, for example, maintaining each other's life and helping each other flourish. Humans and nature are working together to reach harmony between them. This relationship works well to directly benefit both relata. And when we talk about humans as a participant in nature, we mean that nature as a whole contains humans as a part. Humans belong to the community of nature and play a certain role in this community. The relationship between humans and nature is similar to the relationship between a company and its founder. so that we can easily see that if the founder works effectively, the company will do well. At the same time, if the company does well as a part of this company, the founder will share in its goodness too. And therefore, I argue that the participate in nature relationship as a kind of a relation has the relational value as well. And I think I will stop here. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Yunjie.
Thank you very much.
Everyone who has a question can type their name into the chat and you'll be allowed to speak. First, there is Mira's question. Yes, Mira, go on.
Hello, Yunjie.
Hey, hello.
We're both Asian girls.
Oh,
and
yes,
on
sure.
the same topic. Also, but mine, but my thesis highlights the ethical relationship, but it's also relational. Okay,
Oh, good.
I've always asked this question. I don't know how to get out of the snag, because I am also moving from inherent value relationship towards the relational value, and then always I am asked, but your relationships with non-human animals are also in degrees pertinent. Also, it goes back pertinent to their inherent characteristics. In other words, we have more significant relationships with animals that are higher in intelligence or are more or less like us. And then there's also the politics of size. Like, we are more relational with animals who are more or less our size, we can see, okay, than insects or nematodes, for example, worms, something like that. So, and then, you know, the respect and admiration and love are with animals who respond to us. And, you know, a cockroach cannot respond to us. So ultimately, do we relegate the relationship dependent on history, on how historical relations evolve? How do I get out of the snag? I'd like to hear your thoughts. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Your questions are really, really good. I really appreciate you share your questions with me. I think you might miss a little bit. I already mentioned, but I didn't expand a lot in my presentation, which is I said, oh, in the history and the people like philosophers does talk about a lot animal ethics and environment ethics. They have this kind of conflict, like maybe because animals consciousness, some of them, or they can feel pain. So of course, when we interact with those kind of animals, we may have different relationships. So for example, I can have family connections with my dog. I treated my dog as my family members, but maybe I cannot treat my plant or even my golden fish in the top as my family. So it does have the degrees, but the relationship I was talking about with nature is more broad. I didn't specific talking about a friendship with nature or anything else. So of course, when we're talking about friendship with maybe with your dog and your connections with your plant, I agree. We do have this kind of degree differences, but I don't think there is any like conflict will affect us to treat anything worse. Like, I don't think if I have a better friendship with my dog, then I will treat my plant worse. Like, I didn't see the connections here. So I'm not sure I answered your question, but yeah.
All right, thank you so much.
And thank you.
Now, Vladimir.
First of all, thank you ever so kindly for your presentation. It was really, really good and really coherent. I love those presentations. Anyhow, I'm sorry, I'm a little bit drowsy, so I'll try to be as coherent myself as possible. So, as I understood correctly, let us try to introduce the conception of reciprocity within your relational concept. And if we do that, we need to introduce the concepts of moral agency and moral patiency. And having said that, I feel like the relation changes a little bit, because we can be moral agents, but the other side cannot be a moral agent. So we need to redefine this reciprocity in a different regard. I don't know if you already talked about it, so I maybe drifted off, but I feel like this is an important issue to tackle, because at the end of the day, one might ask, well, some relations have more moral value or more moral power than others because they're reciprocal. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think some animal ethics they think moral value or the inherent value we are talking about is actually exactly equal, like we and the animals. But of course, we have different values on other aspects. But when we're talking about the moral values, maybe the same. So, for example, I might I would not treat different about person one and person B. Just a person one is a children, or never talk about a philosophy at all. Like they have different abilities, and they might good at different things, or they might not talk, or they even not capable of thinking. But that is not the way we should think how to treat them, or how to treat them is not we shouldn't think who they are or what are they really capable to doing that. I think that is the point when whatever animal ethics or environmental ethics they wanted to talking about that kind of moral standings, because the moral standing is not to rely on those things, what they are capable of doing anything. Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you, Stanley.
Thank you.
And Rastislav, you can ask your question.
Thank you. First, I really love the presentation and I love your approach.
Thank you.
I think it was very clear. I think it is promising. But here's my question. I was intrigued to I think you rightly separated your own approach and made a difference between your own approach and an account of a subjective, some kind of subjective relationship, subjective value, right? Like
yeah.
we may value a rock, right? But that doesn't
yeah.
mean we have a relationship with a rock. That's not
yeah.
what you're claiming, right?
Yeah.
But then it seems to me, okay, so that's a great case. So on one hand, we have, I have a family dog, as you said, you have a family dog, and on the other hand, you have a rock, right? And there is some kind of relationship with a rock, with a dog, and not a real relationship with a rock, right?
Yeah.
Because the rock is not the kind of thing which can participate in a relationship.
Yeah.
So what I kind of lacked in your account was exactly this kind of account of what counts as a being that can take part in a relationship. Can nature as such take part in a relationship? What would that mean, right? Well, then you would need some kind of an account, some kind of, if not, I understand your criticism of Reagan, and there are these more expensive, right, accounts of like Sturbas and Taylors and so on, where you take into account interests of ecosystems and species and stuff like that, and maybe even plants. But I kind of missed that. A clearer distinction of what kind of being can take part in a relationship, right?
Yeah. Thank you very, very much. I really like your question. You're right. I think I didn't really have the time or to really talk about it, a lot of things in details, but at least I mentioned that to me. So for example, at the last part, I was talking about maybe nature and us or other species, we can participate in nature. So if we participate in nature, that was just one of the examples. So we don't actually have some clear friendship with each other. So I might not think about any clear relationship with the street in the color or like a plant on the street, that kind of stuff. But at least I understand, oh, the tree has its own system, maybe also enjoy the oxygen, and then if the tree grows very well under the corner, that means, oh, we have a better air in this area, so of course I benefit from that too. We don't need to directly have any connection or relations with a tree, but we should understand being a part of the whole system, we are the participant. Yeah, I think maybe that was what I wanted to say. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, I'm really sorry that we don't have the time to ask more questions, but Balam has a great suggestion that we can post the question in the chat. You can make use of the function of sending a private message to the speaker. So you can, if you have some suggestions or some more questions, you can use that to continue a discussion. But now I would like to welcome Gisli, who is going to talk about the minor utopia of the US disability rights struggle. And the screen is yours. You can start.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the invitation, and what a fantastic first presentation to start with. In this presentation, I don't have a PowerPoint, unfortunately, but I hope it will work nonetheless. So in this presentation, I analyzed the achievements of the US disability rights movement through the framework of utopianism. I'm interested in the insights we can draw from the movement into a resistance to forms of oppression that target the utopian impulse. Alison Kafer has powerfully summarized the one-sided utopian thinking at the heart of the non-disabled imaginary. Disability is the site of no future, or at least of no good future. To be disabled has often meant both alive on the margin, vulnerable to violence and injustice, and within a narrow temporal horizon. Disability was erased from the past or made a source of moral and religious stigma, oppressed in the present, and denied a future. This paper traces how a suitable utopian alternative to the utopia of ableism necessarily offers a more ambiguous, fragmented, but also ultimately rich espousal of what it means to imagine a better future that can benefit all people in society. So first, I turn to utopianism and the distinction between major and minor utopias. Utopianism was from its very beginning caught in a tension between the impulse towards abstraction and realization, imagination and prefiguration. The interplay of these impulses has meant that utopianism exhibits several distinct currents, and today can be separated into two broad strands: a visible strand in the form of major utopian projects, and a more covert strand focused on using the utopian impulse to gain critical distance from the status quo. Jay Winter defines the latter as minor utopias, which he characterizes as which are characterized by their partial localized attempt to imagine and implement a different world. They constitute a moment of discontinuity and radical disjuncture to think and act freely, but equally, and I quote him, force us to face the fact that we do not live there, we live here, and we cannot but use the language of the here and now in all our imaginings. Major utopias precisely fail to take account of this fact, which is famously encapsulated in Karl Marx's truism, that people make their own history, but not as they choose. Extending the notion of minor utopia, Matthias Thaler suggests the minor grounded utopias, and I quote, strive to actualize the utopian desire for change in the here and now. To this end, they seek to explore quotidian spaces, open for alternative ways of living. Minor utopias combine a vision of a future world different from our own, with efforts to excavate emancipatory potentials that are latent in the status quo, rather than indulging in wishful thinking. Now, the rest of my paper develops an account of how the US disability rights movement developed such a minor utopia. First, my discussion in the paper tries to show how the US disability rights movement qualifies as a minor utopia because of its concern with a partial renewal of society in the United States. I elaborate what we mean by this partial renewal by turning to Ruth Levitter's formulation of utopia as a method. So Levitas identifies three modes to utopia as a method: an archaeological, ontological, and architectural mode. I will unfortunately have to skip this here and instead summarize what I identify as the key features of the minor utopia, which include the mass mobilization as a social movement, the creation of alternative institutional structures later codified into law and regulation, the development of a distinct positive culture and vision of human value, the formulation of conceptual tools that help assess the present and articulate an alternative future, and a general optimism and enthusiasm about the possibility of radical change. Okay, next I'm going to skip my discussion of how the minor utopian vision of the movement was inflected by the past and present. Let me just quickly emphasize 3 key points. Firstly, the movement was shaped by the rise in industrialization and urbanization during the 20th century. As a consequence, there's a strong focus on work and on living conditions. Secondly, the movement emerged in a context in which disabled people had all but become invisible in society and shut away to be subjected to the authority of medical professionals. The movement thus became strongly focused on identifying society as the problem and rejecting the medical model or approach to disability. Finally, the movement was largely dominated by white, middle class, disabled people, particularly physically disabled and especially wheelchair users. Despite the sensitivity to racism in United States history, so the movement was strongly influenced and informed and benefited from the African-American civil rights struggle. There was nonetheless a hesitancy because of that particular background to engage in anti-racist struggles that undermined the capacity to counter ableism in its intersectional form, combining class, gender, race with disability. Next in the paper, I discuss how the major utopia of ableism works through a distorted conception of temporality. And this came out as well already yesterday in one of the panels. So this manifests itself, for instance, in the desire for the perfect body frozen in time. Disability in this context is cast as out of time. To reclaim its utopian impulse, the disability rights movement had to work towards challenging ableist conception of time, and they do so by introducing this notion of crypt time. Again, I will skip this discussion and instead turn to the final part of the paper, which will be the main emphasis of this presentation. So the final element to the minor utopia of the US disability rights struggle consists in the capacity to think and act freely, to imagine a society less marred by injustice and violence towards the disability community. There are at least 3 ways of approaching the moment of discontinuity and radical disjuncture in utopianism. In practical utopian terms, in the form of utopian theory building, and through utopian literature. They are all present and they're vital to the efforts of the disability community to reimagine ableist society. Each approach provides a distinct but interrelated formulation of what we might call cryptopia. So cryptopias are a fictitious departure from the here and now that aims to delineate and push the boundaries of a different way of thinking about disability. They are part of a minor utopia insofar as the utopian visions reflect the present and remain partial attempts to restructure the world. I will address each of the approaches separately, starting with practical utopias. So the most famous example of a practical cryptopia can be found in the independent living centers. Practical utopias are characterized by living out elements of the hope for future in the present, and they are incubators of change. And the independent living movement responded to the headway made by disability activists in the fight for inclusion into public life. Disabled people gained entrance to urban spaces in the 1960s. So for instance, Ed Roberts, who's the leader of the movement in Berkeley, gains access to the university in Berkeley. Judy Heumann, leader in New York, gains access to, at least litigates her way successfully into having the possibility of teaching as a wheelchair users. And there are many others who do similar things in the 1960s. And so as a result of that, there was a need created to support the independent living outside of institutions and the family. This was also an opportune moment to replace the utopian impulse of architecture, centered on a desire for the perfect space inhabited by perfect bodies, and to replace it with a form of city planning formulated around human variability. The movement developed a shared utopian vision of a society in which all humans are recognized as having personhood and the right and capacity to live free from the social barriers of disablement. I'll say more about that in a second. This vision was implemented in the present by pooling funding, pooling expertise, pooling information. So that's really the main focus of the Independent Living Center. The centers introduced peer counseling schemes to replace the paternalistic medical framework, and they offered practical advice on how to find accommodation and how to gain employment opportunities. So the independent living centers differ from the typical example of a practical utopia, the communes of the 1960s. And Lintauer Sargent terms these intentional communities and defines them as consisting of, and I quote, a group of 5 or more adults and their children, if any, who come from more than one nuclear family and who have chosen to live together to enhance their shared values or for some other mutually agreed upon purpose. So the centers meet the criterion that they are not just a matter of convenience, but sustain a communal normative stance, that of the independent living philosophy. However, their emphasis on integration in society, while simultaneously highlighting individual autonomy, necessarily counters the idea of a separate and separated commune. So, the emphasis on integration, of course, goes against this idea of a separate incubator of change. And then the emphasis on individual autonomy necessarily goes against utopian visions of communal living. Good, so the second phase of utopianism, social theory building, takes a number of different forms in the disability rights movement. Theory building entails a critical reflection on the roles of utopia in society and for positive social change. The most important example is the articulation of the independent living philosophy and what is known as the social model of disability. So the social model separates out physical and mental impairments from disability. And it argues that disability is imposed on top of these impairments. So a society which is built to accommodate an idealized version of the body and the mind. So disability comes into play when you try to go into a building, you have a physical impairment, there are no lifts and there's no accessible toilets. And similarly, university, if you have certain conceptions of intelligence, of reasonableness, of how to communicate, etc. Right? So that's the social model. Another example of social theory building is Irving Solar's memoir, Missing Pieces. So Irving Solar was a founding father of disability studies, and he considers in this memoir what an inclusive world could look like by engaging with the example of Het Dorp. Het Dorp was a Dutch utopian community built to meet the needs of wheelchair users, and Solar visited it in the 1970s as a visiting scholar to the Netherlands. So Solar is critical of this utopian project, Het Dorp, because it is built within a paternalistic model in which non-disabled people make all the decisions. So it's a utopian community which is built for disabled people, specifically wheelchair users, so that they can have a reasonably barriers-free life, but it isn't built for them. They do not get to make any of the decisions and so on. Drawing on this example helps Solar reflect on his own engagement with physical impairment and how he moved from viewing his impairment as a hindrance to be overcome to treating it as a characteristic of life worth integrating. Anything, and I quote, that separates and negates those with a chronic condition will ultimately invalidate not only them, but everyone else, because impairment is an integral part of the human condition. A more suitable engagement with disability in the future entails a transcendence of society of the tendency to distance and separate out disability to make it not one's problem. As the last phase of utopianism, I turn to utopian literature, and this was also mentioned yesterday. So some writer activists within the disability rights movement have focused on the treatment of disability in utopian literature and see it as indicative of the way that utopian thought and action is ableist. Disability, they highlight, has always played an important role in utopian and dystopian fiction. In some cases, disability provides a mechanism of critique and a means to test the utopian credentials of the proposed vision. A utopia is evaluated on the extent to which the projected society accommodates or even improves the lives of those with impairments. Other times, the focus in human improvement tips over into a more overtly problematic eugenic logic that connects the vision of a good society with the disposal of disabled bodies. And here, Plato's Republic is often the famous example. Now, the connection between utopia and eugenics has led some to reject utopianism altogether. More generally, literature often uses disability as a narrative prosthesis, and they're very critical of this because disabled people in this are reduced to their disability and they serve merely to guide the reader and help advance the plot. So in response to these links between utopianism and ableism, disability writer activists have written explicit utopian fiction dedicated to envisioning a more inclusive society. And in doing so, they offered at the same time a critique of contemporary society. And I will representatively go through the example of Vic Winkelstein, who was a leading UK disability activist and writer, and he wrote a well-known Cryptopia. And I'm going to go through this really, really fast. It's quite short, but I will go through it even faster. So if you are interested, you can find it online if you just search Finkelstein and Utopia, or you can just email me and I'll send a link. Okay, so Finkelstein in 1975, he offers this tongue-in-cheek satire that tells the story of a utopian community set up by wheelchair users. And with the environment, he argues, finally adjusted to fit wheelchair users' needs, everyone in that community is said to be happy. Able-bodied people, in contrast, are, and I quote, rarely seen and little understood, and become the subject of a medical model, which is now inverted. The normalization of wheelchair use means that they are continuously confronted by physical barriers in their daily lives. For instance, ceilings have been lowered because wheelchair users do not need such a high ceiling. And so the able-bodied people end up constantly bumping their head against the ceiling. The able-bodied are forced to distort their bodies to such an extent that they too become impaired. However, unfortunately for them, they are impaired in a way that does not fit the community's vision of what people ought to look like. Able-bodied people face social and economic exclusion within a system not adapted to divergence from the wheelchair user's norm, and they become subject of charity and of pity. At the end of the story, the able-bodied members of society start to realize that they have never been asked to participate in the decisions shaping their lives. As a result of that, they end up forming a movement that in their wildest dreams could one day overcome the physical barriers to their existence. Okay, so none of these projects represent efforts in mapping out major utopias devoid of imperfection and conflict. And all of them constitute ambiguous spaces for rethinking the present and future. Finkelstein's utopian fiction has a narrow focus on physical impairments of wheelchair users. Zola's engagement with disability is very Western-centric. Nonetheless, these writings are important because they form one of several ways in which the disability rights movement in the United States and beyond challenged the status quo in the 20th century by targeting utopianism itself. Okay, so in conclusion, this paper has explored the utopianism of the US disability rights movement in the 20th century, leading up to the passing of the Americans with Disabilities Act in 1990. Turning to utopian studies, I identified in the activism the contours of a minor utopia, aimed at a localized partial prefiguration of a more inclusive world. Drawing on disability studies and activism, I brought out the varied engagements with utopia within the movement, from a large-scale critique of the utopia of ableism, which I skipped, to the utopian fiction and memoirs of disability activists and writers. The disability rights movement was and continues to be a site of contestation and a reworking of the very idea of what it means to desire an alternative future, taking up most forcefully in the conception of cryptopia and cryptfuturity. Thank you for listening.
Okay, thank you very much. And now whoever wants to ask a question, they should type their name into the chat. And the first one is Balam. So Balam can ask a question.
Hi, thank you so much for your great talk. I just wanted to, well, I mean, I agree with all of your points. Just when I was listening to you, I was thinking of sort of a utopian moment I had this year. I don't know if you saw the documentary Crib Camp that came out. And when I saw, because I had no idea that camp existed, and sort of like their rhetoric was kind of so beyond their time. And it wasn't just rhetoric, it was practice too, like the way it was kind of like a spontaneous utopia, and now it no longer exists. It only exists in the past, and now sort of like it comes to us in documents. And I didn't talk to anyone in sort of like the disability area about this, because now we're all sort of like stranded. So I'd love to like hear your thoughts about that, and whether it's kind of like this. I had the Blochian kind of oh, here's the resource from the past, because it was such forward thinking. It was sort of like the seeds of the disability rights movement. But on the other hand, I think it wasn't sort of like the white middle class wheelchair user movement that began, but it was something that what the movement is trying to become today. And it was already kind of like there. So I don't know if this makes sense, but hearing your talk just reminded me of whether that can be thought of as sort of like a little spinning of a utopia for crib futures.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So Crib Camp, which came out recently, and I know I watched it, and I think one of the interesting things about it is precisely because, you know, when you talk about to the activists of that time, they don't really think about themselves in that way at all, right? They don't think of themselves as doing something utopian or even in any way kind of academically interesting in terms of theory building or anything like that. And I think that's part of why we watch something like this, like, oh, there was this camp, and oh, this was so revolutionary, what is happening here? And so, yeah, I think that is really fascinating. I hadn't even thought about it as, you know, in those kind of temporal terms and what it does to us, that we're now kind of watching at it. The one thing that I would say is, and I would have to rewatch Crib Camp to think about that, but there are, of course, also very strong elements in the movement. If you read the interviews, you watch the interviews and so on, that are kind of very much of their time as well, right? So it's kind of, yes, there are some elements that are still very, very utopian, but there are also other elements where you're like, ooh.
Yeah. I mean, it's still kind of like the people who are the talking heads are mostly like white and sort of like educated and so on. But it's just like the aspects where sort of like everyone is included in the decision making, and everyone is helping each other and carrying each other. Everyone is doing everything, and you know, like people are sort of like discovering and thinking about crib sexuality and so on. And like they're in some of the elements, I think it's very like sort of like forward dawning, and of course in some of the elements it's very of its time as well.
Yeah, one of those kind of really fascinating examples of this is how Irving Sola has this idea of, he mentions script time briefly, and then Alice Cafe and others pick it up. And you look at the original source, and he just mentions it in passing, because for him it's just, you know, anyway, that's a thing we do. Whereas now we pick this up as this kind of really revolutionary and interesting way of challenging temporality. And so I think that's always kind of very interesting with utopian movements, in a way that they don't even think about themselves as, oh, this is a very interesting utopian way of challenging, of reconstructing, deconstructing, whatever have you, what is happening right now. Because yeah, like crib time, obviously, right? Everyone knows that.
Okay, now Philip.
Thanks so much.
Question?
Yeah, good morning, and thank you very much. So this is a question that comes very much from a place of ignorance, because I really don't know much about this topic at all. And yeah, I don't know how how to put it properly, but I will just try. So what I got from the talk and your concern was, on the one hand, a concern with, a criticism of utopians or utopian visions that kind of have this kind of eugenic moment, get rid of all this, or try to erect a society in which everybody is, in a way, super able-bodied or whatever. And on the other hand, the other moment I saw was then to also give the voice to, and not erect this kind of vision without them, but just let them have an equal part or even more of a say, because it's after all them. And so I totally agree. But then the thought I had was, isn't it also conceivable that, for instance, then if all the wheelchair users, let's say, somewhere are asked, and they want to be part of this kind of world creation, that they also just say, yeah, but it sucks sitting in a wheelchair, so we want to invest funding in healing spinal problems so that we can all walk again or something. So because if one, I don't know, it feels like there's some kind of tension there. You can't say, well, but you should just be proud of this, because then you don't let them speak for themselves. So I'm just trying to get to terms with this. So what do you think about this?
Great question. So, and absolutely not from a place of ignorance at all, because that is, a tension at the heart of much of the disability debate. The first thing I wanted to say to your first part, just because it's an opportunity for me to reiterate that, I'm not as interested personally in kind of challenging utopianism. Utopian literature. It has been done fantastically. What I find interesting, particularly in some of the kind of more political, historical literature on utopia that I'm engaging with, which is very much, built around the sense of despair in the 20th century with the collapse of the major utopian projects, to say here's actually an example of really a massive project, thinking about people in 1960s completely excluded from society, subject to the worst forms of violence, of apartheid in these asylums, and then they managed to pass massive legislations to have a massive impact on society. So it's a kind of more positive project rather than trying to say, okay, I'm playing out these different things against each other. And as you were saying, it's in a way just to foreground those voices as part of the project in the show. Actually, here's some great examples of very successful utopian thinking and action. But to your larger point, Alison Kafer goes into this fantastically, so I'm not going to even try to do it as well. If you want to have a look, she was mentioned yesterday as well. She has this book on crib disability and feminism, something like that. So she talks about exactly that there's this tension starting with a social model where you reject any kind of medical improvements or any kind of ideas of the medical framework, but then you also have to realize that this creates these kind of tensions, right? And there isn't a straightforward answer to that at all. And that's part of what I also want to try to get at, that this isn't an attempt to give the right answer. Sometimes the social model went in that direction, as if somehow if we only transcend disability, then everything is going to be great. And that was exactly criticized for that reason. So you're spot on. And I think, yeah, it's a really interesting point.
Thank you for the clarification.
Okay, Andreas, you can ask a question.
Silent.
Good. Okay. Well, again, I'm no specialist in the area, but I'm just wondering from daily observations and having traveled quite a bit in Spain, I just wonder whether sometimes other countries can form a concrete utopia that or other cultures and countries just work better than others, it seems to me, right? Okay, you focus on the US and I learned a bit from that. But traveling quite frequently in Spain, I noticed that for some reason or another, and I'm as I said, I'm not a specialist in it. It seems to me they have a better handle on this than many other countries, and there might be other examples that I just don't know of, right? I mean, it starts with the provision to public buildings and private buildings. But there are also organizations like ONCE. I don't know whether you ever heard about this lottery that was formed and organized by people who are visually impaired, but now stretches their services way beyond the blind or the visually impaired, and university attracts and works with everyone who has a disability, and they are present in daily life. If you go to a small Spanish town anywhere in Spain, you will see the local ONCE man or woman with whatever handicap they have or whatever impairment they have, selling their lottery tickets. There's a daily visibility that reminds people constantly that this needs sorting or needs some help or needs solidarity, whatever way you want to put it. And it seems to be a very good way to engage with the public. Yeah? They also have their own infrastructure, they have their own foundations, and so on and so forth. And obviously it came out of a need where probably I assume the Spanish state at one point wasn't very good in helping people who are impaired. So they went and did this private-public initiative, which now turns out to be a massive operation. I mean, it's in the lives of everyone. Yeah? You see it every day. There's contact every day. There's personal contact as well. And it seems to me much more of a kind of almost more concrete political utopia than some of the great things about forming cooperatives and collectives. I mean, that might be one way of dealing with it, sure. But I like this ONCE program so much because it's in your daily life, right? You engage with it daily.
That's great. In terms of the project I'm planning, I'm first going to look at African Americans' contribution to the original movement in the US, and then moving on. I was going to move on to Africa, but I see I should make a stop in Spain because this sounds absolutely fascinating. And I think in many ways really speaks to what I was looking at in the US context as a project that is not just, as you were saying, it's not just communes, but it is a utopian project that is really implemented at large scale and inflects and shapes the whole society. So that's really fascinating. Yes, in terms of different and how these utopias, how they are implemented or how successful they are and which countries are fertile. Yeah, that is a really interesting question. So for instance, when it comes to disability activism, India is very, very strong with that. And then you have different countries, and of course the history and the context matters a lot. There are several societies and organizations in the UK focused on visual impairments, but it seems that they have a very different context in which perhaps they could not provide those kind of large-scale utopian projects. So that's really interesting. Thank you for bringing that to my attention.
Just briefly, I mean, what it seems to me avoid is this kind of avoiding ghettos, right? Putting people into corners or hiding them from the public view. And I think one of the great things in Spain is that they just do that,
Exactly, yeah. So it's part of that emphasis on integration, on making it visible, to reject the marginalization. And yeah, it sounds like this is really well. As I said, I'm not as familiar with that case, and I will totally look it up because it seems to fit perfectly. So fantastic, thank you.
Okay, and I would feel bad skipping Sam's question once again. So Sam, you can ask your question, and then Elias will be given a few more minutes. Don't worry.
Okay, thank you very much, and thank you for a really engaging paper. 2 questions, really, or I think it's 2 questions. The first one is really focused on the limits of community or the perils of community. And the ways in which any notion of community is simultaneously a kind of call to solidarity and potentially a prison. And I wonder whether part of your work might focus precisely on just thinking critically about the way in which, I think it was Barry Hinders some years ago wrote something in which he said, the problem is, community still is an idea that still holds us captive. It's the thing that's the oneness that still holds us captive. So Barry Hinders would be, I think it's the book From Power from Hobbes to Foucault, in which he says that. Iris Marion Young says something similar in one of her papers, talking about our political visions and the limits of this of a kind of unitary notion of the political, which then sent me to thinking about minor utopias. And I don't know whether the literature on minor utopias references Foucault's notion of heterotopia, but it seemed to me that might be quite useful for thinking about some of the movements that you're interested in plotting. So just a couple of, I don't know whether it's a question or a comment really, but, but thank you.
No, fantastic. And I will keep my answer short because I know we have to move on. No, that's great. I wrote all of that down. One of the things that as I'm moving on will come more into focus is a kind of more communal or relational understanding of utopia and disability. So this will be front and center, will be really relevant, thinking exactly about what are the limits of that? What are the limits of kind of groupthink or something along those lines? And then, yeah, connecting to heterotopia is also a great suggestion. So thank you so much. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Gisli, once more. And now we move to Technological Unemployment and the Post-Work Utopia by Elias Moser. So the screen's yours.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me. Thank you all for watching my presentation. May I share the screen with you? Is that possible? Right?
Yes, it should be set up for you.
So prepared a couple of slides. As I was introduced, it was said that I'm going to talk about post-work utopia, an idea that is currently discussed in public discourse, but also in scholarly discourse on automation, and especially with respect to the challenges of artificial intelligence for future labor markets. And actually, I wanted to choose a very fanciful sort of science fiction picture for this presentation, but then I found that my university has the slogan, "We work for tomorrow." And I would just turn this into a question asking, do we still need to work tomorrow? And this question is quite depicts the topic of my talk. So the title is a bit different than in the abstract, but this shouldn't bother you too much. Conditions of a post-work utopia. Now, just briefly, what am I talking about? The post-work utopia is basically based on a couple of predictions on the development of future labor markets and the future economic developments. And one of which is that technological progress, especially with respect to the developments in artificial intelligence, smart robotics, will obviate the need to work or drastically reduce it. That's one of the predictions on which the utopia is based. And the other prediction that we can also observe historically as materializing is that technological progress will highly increase our material standards of living. It increases our real income, so the amount of goods we are able to consume with the same amount of money is increasing with technological progress. Now, based on these two predictions, one can think of a future, a possible future in which we've overcome the need to work, but nevertheless are able to satisfy our needs and even more have a decent income, decent real income, and are able to consume a lot of goods. So it's a possible future of leisure and abundance. Here I posted also a couple of book covers, which I found to be quite telling. The first book is actually one which inspired much of my talks, by John Danaher, who recently published this book, Automation and Utopia. And I just put it there because the cover is just amazing. It kind of sketches what this is all about. And the second book cover I posted is the one of Aaron Bastani, Fully Automated Luxury Communism. The book is entitled. Yeah, if you just hear that title, it's already telling the story. And last but not least, Yuval Noah Harari, who is never afraid of speculating about the human nature and publicly publishing his thesis. He's also devoted a substantial part of his book Homo Deus on the idea that in the near future we might have overcome the need to work and instead can devote our life to other things. Now, the idea of a post-work utopia has probably been most prominently formulated by John Maynard Keynes, the famous economist, who wrote in his possibilities for our grandchildren, economic possibilities for our grandchildren. He wrote down a couple of ideas, basically, how we have to think of the future, and he was quite optimistic. So probably we are now John Maynard Keynes' grandchildren, if you consider him a 1930 scholar. But we have not yet seen the post-work utopia being realized. But let me just write a citation of him in order to also flesh out what the idea of the post-work utopia is about. When we look into the future, when we look into the past, we find that the economic problem, the struggle for subsistence, always has been hitherto the primary, most pressing problem of the human race. Not only of the human race, but of the whole of the biological kingdom, from the beings of life in its most primitive forms. So what he has in mind is not the idea that, well, consumption is nice and leisure is also nice. So a post-work utopia might be a desirable future, but he has really in mind some idea of the human project that basically it has been one of our most fundamental problems. It is one of our most fundamental problems to struggle for our subsistence. And economic gains, economic progress can help us to overcome this struggle. And then in the latter part of his article, he writes, when the accumulation of wealth is no longer of high social importance, there will be great changes in the code of morals. What Keynes has in mind is that we get rid of a couple of moral convictions we have nowadays because we still are entangled in the struggle for subsistence. But these moral convictions might not be apt for the future. And what Keynes does here is he says there will be great changes. So he predicts that morality will change, morality will adapt to new circumstances. But I would make this a question. I would ask, what has to change in our code of morals, what has to change in our moral convictions in order to be apt for a future where the need to work might be overcome. And this is the question I'm asking in this talk. So first of all, let me go through this quickly. One has to say a couple of things about automation and the economic process of technological development. So we can think of technological progress in terms of replacement of work with machines. We use machines because they are cheaper and they're more efficient than humans. And then this process innovation, as it is called, frees the workforce that is formerly in these jobs that produce the goods that nowadays machines can produce. So this free workforce, this description of the long run technological progress, free workforce will be used because there is another sort of technological progress, which is called product innovation. This free workforce is used then to produce new other marketable goods. And over the years, over the decades, over the centuries, say, so in the very long run, these process and product innovations, they go hand in hand and they lead to economic growth. And that's the very instance of economic growth is actually these two things. In the long run, there's nothing more decisive to economic wealth than technological progress. So now the thesis exists, and that's why this has become more prominent in the recent public discourse, this idea of a post-work utopia. The thesis existed is that artificial intelligence and the current wave of automation is different than before. And it is different in that the product innovation cannot keep pace with the process innovation. So the replaceability of jobs is faster than the creation of new jobs through the invention of new marketable goods. So that is a fear or an anxiety that is often expressed by different economists, but also by social scientists, that this might happen. And this is the case because artificial intelligence does not only threaten the industrial jobs, which do not require much of cognitive skills, but it replaces a lot of different jobs. Also, such jobs which we would assume are not the ones on the threat of extinctions. For instance, it is now being discussed whether in the future we still need tort lawyers. We could also use legal subsumption programs that evaluate different facts of each case and come to an impartial judgment about the case. So even what is called white collar jobs might go extinct because of different opportunities we have with the invention of artificial intelligence and algorithms. And there's a couple of other things being discussed, which are put into place as reasons why this time automation might lead to huge unemployment. So the thesis is really now a fear that technological progress in the age of AI will cause a lot of jobs being replaced and therefore cause a lot of unemployed. And this citation is by Branofson-McAfee, distinguished economist, in a widely cited publication. And always when something is very widely cited, something is very oft cited, you can imagine that the thesis that is being defended in the publication is quite provocative. And so is the one by these two scholars I just read it in order to outline what economists nowadays might fear. Rapid and accelerating digitalization is likely to bring economic disruption stemming from the fact that as computers get more powerful, companies have less need for some kinds of workers. Technological progress is going to leave behind some people, perhaps even a lot of people, as it races ahead. There's never been a worse time to be a worker with only ordinary skills. So that's the economic fear, actually focusing on the idea of technological unemployment. So now, and now I skipped the slide, but nevertheless, I'll just explain what I skipped. Now one can turn this fear into a more optimist view, right? One can see this as a historical chance to restructure our society. Artificial intelligence is able to replace many jobs also we would not conceive of as very fulfilling or very meaningful, and we don't need to pursue these jobs anymore in the future. And this could open the doors for our post-work utopia, because what will not happen is the fact that we on average have a lower standard of living. Our standard of living is increasing with technological progress, but the need to work will be replaced. So instead of this fear that I just described by these two economists, we could also express this as a sort of hope for a better future. Now, one thing for one problem that exists for this better future, if you so will, is the problem of technological unemployment, and that is problematic because work, as we nowadays have it in our society, is the main source of income for the vast majority of people. So this, although Keynes predicted something differently, this is still the case. Most people need to work in order to generate income. Now, what also happens through automation in general and with AI in special, AI-imposed automation might render work a significantly less important economic input factor. So what happens is that work becomes ever less important, and we tend to need less work in order to produce our goods, and in turn, capital becomes very, very important. Now, what is necessary therefore for a post-work utopia is some sort of redistributive scheme to subsidize the unemployed. So it's highly important for our imaginary of a post-work society that we are assuming a state will tax capital and redistribute it to those people who are now unable to perform work and to create an income. So that's fairly easy to understand. So what is often proposed by different post-work utopians, as I may call it, is a proposal of a universal basic income. The idea that we should redistribute income such that every person, independent of his or her efforts to work, independent of his or her specific circumstances, receives a monthly or weekly periodical payment. So this idea has become more and more vividly discussed among people who perceive the future as an opportunity to restructure our society towards post-work society. Now, there's another problem that remains, and that's basically the fact that even if we have a redistributive scheme in place, for example, the universal basic income, there's still an idea we usually have, a moral conviction we usually have, and that is that work is essential to lead a good life. And in turn, the lack of work threatens to sever individuals' ability to lead a good life. So let me flesh out this moral ideal a bit. In today's world, work is a constitutive part of individuals' life. It enables them to acquire skills and craftsmanship. It enables them to socially interact and to gain recognition, and provides people with meaning and purpose. So these are the most common things one would say about the value of work, about the moral ideal. Now, just to quickly outline the two most important values being discussed as being attached to work. On the one hand is the acquisition of self-respect, namely that one is, through work, one is able to contribute something to society that is actually valued by other people. And this evaluation is best pronounced, is best shown by somebody being ready to pay a salary for one's contribution, right? So work is often seen as highly important because it is a source for self-respect. The other thing, just a bit harder to explain, but nevertheless I try, is the attainment of meaning in life. Now, the good life, or conceptions of the good life, they go beyond mere hedonic conceptions. Conceptions that say happiness is the value we seek, and they go beyond mere preference satisfaction views, say that the good life consists in the fulfillment of our desires. So these ideas of the good life are more substantial. And one way to put more substance in the concept of the good life is to refer to meaning in life, as for instance Susan Wolf does or Thaddeus Metz do. So what is meaning in life? It's to have an impact on our environment, to have an impact on the world, to be causally connected with others, with the world which is around us. And therefore, it is not something that we can reduce to a mere positive feeling, such as hedonistic approaches, and it's not something we can reduced to desire fulfillment, but it's really the fact that we do something and we have an impact on others. And that is necessary for meaning in life. And that is also something that is seen as being provided. The possibility to acquire meaning is seen as being implied by the ability to pursue paid labor. Here we also have a couple of other mentions. For instance, I want to say excellence, the attainment of excellence is something important, or social interaction is something important. Also, personal identity is often said to be something that makes work valuable beyond the mere income. Now, to summarize these arguments, they're basically saying, well, in order to lead a good life, it is necessary to pursue work, to pursue paid labor. Now, let me just briefly sketch a couple of objections one could make here. The first objection would be sort of a Marxist idea of alienation. To say that that in fact work is mostly detrimental to self-esteem and meaning. And although Marx has lived 150 years ago, this might still have not changed in our society. It's not industrial work that makes us that is detrimental to our self-esteem and meaning in life, but also these ordinary office jobs we have in our society, which many people have to pursue. They are also not very fulfilling. So the argument basically says that in fact work is really not valuable. The other counter argument one can make is that crucial distinction by Hannah Arendt says that we must distinguish between work on the one hand and labor on the other. Now, work is a broader conception of all sorts of activities a person can pursue, a person can fulfill. But it does not have to be rewarded by a salary. And it does not also have to be productive in an economic sense. It does not need to create economic value. Whereas labor is the more economic term of productivity and activity of a person, which is in fact for which is in fact necessary that the person creates some surplus value. Now, based on this distinction, one could simply say, well, for achieving meaning and for achieving self-esteem and self-respect, social recognition, it is only necessary that people can pursue the former and not the latter. People have to be able to produce something which is perceived to be valuable by others. This could also be leisure activities. One can produce art without any economic value, but nevertheless gain recognition by others and therefore boost his or her self-esteem.
Okay, I'm sorry, Elias. Can you just speed up and maybe we could move to the discussion?
Did I not see the chat? Yeah, I'm very sorry. What time is it? Yes, I'm very sorry. Now, let me just finish with this observation. Is that Actually, one thing we have to reconsider and remember Keynes' idea that in order to arrive at a society in which work is not needed anymore, and which presumably is a good society in which we've overcome the need to work, there need to be also some changes to our moral convictions. One thing that has to change is that that we have to get rid of the conviction that in order to lead a good life, work is a necessary condition. What we have to overcome is a work ethic that is currently being in place. We are now perceiving our lives through our moral lens, perceiving our lives as being dependent on work and on paid labor, which provides us with meaning and provides us with excellence and self-esteem and identity. But this is a contingent fact. And what we have to overcome in order to build a post-work utopia is to get rid of this moral conviction. So thank you very much. I'm very sorry for taking too long.
Thank you. We still have a bit of time to take some questions. And the first one was Andreas, and it's a special question related to the arguments put forward by Andre Götz. So you can go ahead.
Yeah, let me just provoke Elias a little bit. I mean, what's new here compared to what Andre Götz has put forward over the last 40, 50 years? I mean, the books are all in the public realm. I heard nothing new that would distinguish your argument from that of Götz. On top of that, I think Götz is in some cases probably a little bit more, I don't know what the word is, a little bit more sophisticated in this argument, because he makes this distinction between heteronomy and autonomy in work. So work that is based first on necessities, and second, the work that is based on freedom that we do for ourselves. I mean, all these arguments have been put forward, have been discussed for years, and I heard no reference in your presentation to any of that. But let me challenge you further that when it comes to technology and technological advancement, I mean, Götz would be so good to introduce also an ecological argument in the discussion, which I missed a little bit in your presentation. And we can all agree that the labor metaphysics, is a thing of a past. I mean, Götz nicely made that argument by writing his book Farewell to the Working Class, in which he outlined that in great detail. And as to the universal basic income, I would like to hear a little bit more what that means in times of the pandemic. I mean, most Western countries have a pretty comprehensive scheme that comes pretty close to what Götz and others have proposed in terms of basic income. I would like to take that a little bit further, because it seems to me that some of that basic income hasn't got rid of many of the inequalities that COVID has also produced. So where do we stand now with universal basic income in that respect? I can have a few more questions here, but I hold back. Otherwise, I will dominate the discussion here.
Yeah, one thing you're right with is the reference to Andre Götz. Of course, I did not reference it, and I apologize for it. Yeah, I mean, one thing that Götz says is that this idea that work provides us with meaning is actually something that that is used quite instrumentally, or it could also be seen as a strategic ideology that is produced by employers in order to make their employees more productive. So the critique goes further, is actually saying, well, this idea, we might think of it as one of our core moral convictions, namely that work provides us with some meaningful activity. That is actually something that is that is strategically used in order to deceive us and to be more productive. So that would be an interesting thought, and it's definitely included in the critique on this idea that in order to lead a good life, work is necessary. And what goes on is also a decisive critique against the work ethic, which in which Henri Gortz is definitely a good read. Now the second question, I don't remember too well, probably because I could not answer it properly.
A basic income under COVID conditions is already a practice widely pursued in many countries. What's the difference?
What's the difference between now and the situation in which basic income is in place? Now, basic income nowadays, if you refer to subsidies by the government because because of the shutdown, these cannot be compared to a basic income, because people are not able to receive any further money by pursuing work. A basic income idea presupposes that it is a basis, and then additional income can be achieved by offering one's services on the labor market. So and also it's not something that is guaranteed to you as your fundamental right as a citizen of the state, but rather as a replacement for the inability to work. And I would consider the regimes you now see an emergency law solution, and not a universal basic income.
Okay, now we can take Hugo's question.
Yeah, thank you. So an additional problem I want to point to, even though perhaps you would have said something about this in the things that you weren't able to take up, is that it's not only the case that work today is the main source of income for the individual, it's also the main source of income for the state, because the state get money from taxation of work. So that means that if UBI should be implemented on a grand scale, sort of leading us away from work totally, that would mean that some kind of expropriation of companies would be needed. And this is an argument that especially in German Marxist circles are pretty well discussed, that people who have suggested UBI are often quite naive when it comes to the fact that this would lead to the end of capitalism as we know it, and actually also of the state as we know it. And from my point of view, that makes the whole thing even more interesting. But I think that it's a problem or a fact that needs to be discussed much more, that these changes are not just a small addition to our life as we live them in our society, but would actually change much more than people are willing to concede. So perhaps more of a comment than a question, but thank you.
Oh, thank you for the comment, and maybe I also have the chance to bit better flesh out the idea of the universal basic income, which was the question before, which might not properly have addressed. Now, yes, you're right. I mean, this is not something which should take lightly. A universal basic income is not just another form of redistribution. It's not just the social subsidy, but it really should, in the long run at least, have a decisive impact on our convictions about work, and our convictions of the pursuit of different life plans, and it also has a huge impact economically. I mean, think of all the work that needs to be done just because of economic coercion. There's a broad range of jobs which no one would voluntarily do, and we cannot assume that people would do that. And salaries for the jobs for these jobs would need to substantially rise in order to set an incentive for people to work in these jobs. Now we can hope that robots will take over some of them, but we cannot assume that automation will fully obviate all sorts of work, and fully automate all sorts of work which are contingent upon economic coercion. Now, just leave it there.
Okay, I'm afraid Mira's question will be the last one that gets asked. If it's a quick one.
Mine is fast, okay, and very practical, okay. And yes, this is a problem I see, okay. You're going to create a whole regime of robots, a whole AI system running a whole society. Okay, at the foot of that, you still need humans who will maintain and run those robots. Until you go infinite regress, you will make robots making cars. At the foot of that is still mankind laden with the labor of running the whole and maintaining the whole thing. And goodness knows if many of us will want to take that job. So ultimately, we'll still be enslaved. So that's just it.
Yeah, I mean, this thought experiment has to go through a bit more at length in order to arrive at a point at which we can think of it properly. But really, the idea is not only that some machines come and they replace some jobs, but really that some algorithms are, for instance, capable of inventing new products that can be sold to people. So there's no humans in the process, and these algorithms they can gather data, they can evaluate data, things now humans do, in order to marketize these products to people, which is already done by online services. These are not humans evaluating the data, right? These are algorithms saying this person wants to buy that and that product. So all these sorts of processes can be skipped and actually outsourced to a machine. And of course you're right. Some jobs will not disappear, and I think you're right in saying, well, just leads to a regress, and at some point the human needs to be there. But I wouldn't consider it as a human who steers a machine, because that can also be done by computers.
Okay, thank you. Once more, I'm afraid we have to move to the last presentation.
Thank you.
And you can put your questions in the chat. You can try to engage in some discussion over there. And now I would like to welcome our two last speakers of the morning session, and that's Hadje and PJ. and they are going to talk about the philosophical analysis of thanatopolitics in the Philippine public health crisis. Welcome and feel free to start.
So a pleasant afternoon. I just want to check if everyone can hear me.
Yes.
Sounds good.
Again, a pleasant afternoon and greetings coming here from the Philippines, here in Manila. And I am joined today by my colleague. We worked in the same university before in the Philippines, Mr. Hadje, Sadje. So for today, let me just share my screen. Just for a few minutes. There we go. Cheers. So I just want to check if you can see my screen.
Yes, we can.
Okay, there we go. So the title of our presentation, of course, is Hope and Despair, a philosophical analysis of thanatopolitics and the Philippine public health crisis. This is actually a work in progress, but for the sake of course, being able to discuss the important points, I'm going to narrow it down to the crucial aspects of the paper. So our presentation is a work in progress that aims to contribute an articulation on how life and death are caught in the labyrinth of a social and political process in terms of what we call and thematize as building life in communities of death, which suggests how a vision of the good life raises the question on how utopian visions can create the obverse of what is envisioned. And conversely, how the thought of a dystopia can provide the possibility for a utopian vision of what could be different that can trigger change. The approach that we provide follow the lines of a critical theory of society that is set to describe the wrong set of things, informed by a materialist critique from one's material standpoint. That is to say, what remains amiss in the act of constructing a picture of a perfect world or a perfect society. Our initial reading works on the conceptual resources from Foucault and Adorno, particularly on the importance of critique emphasized by both thinkers, classified as a history of the present. It will follow three discussion points. First, discussing Foucault's concept of biopolitics that emphasizes the play of politics of life and death. Informed by a materialist content, or to put substance to that idea, we'll be sharing some stories of struggle from the Philippine realities, particularly coming from the current situation under this current pandemic. And of course, the visions of utopia from thoughts of dystopia. So I'll start from that idea from building life in communities of death. Before the invention of vaccines, we could say that death was a constant companion of life under a condition of a political authority vested with a power that simply possesses life. That is to say, a political practice where the right of the sovereign seizes the body and spirit. Nevertheless, with a practice of authority that seizes bodies described to be quite unreflective of its generalizing epistemic orientation, such a situation only exposed our biological existence to the risk of dying from the unknown forces of nature. In a poetic fashion, definition of life is like picking a saccharine chord of a musical instrument. Life is a sweet tune whose sound dies in an instant when the playing ceases. As a remedy to such precarious condition, the development of modern rationality under its scientific paradigm aimed to reverse the certainty of death and shifted to the certainty of life, to the point of disallowing it to reach its demise. In other words, the rigor of the scientific calculation served as its instrument to foster life. This provided the form for a politics whose force is characterized by a power over life that tailored a logic of control in the concrete domain of the body. As emphasized by Foucault, however, it is a subtle exercise of control through an exercise of supervision and intervention, where power works not in a centripetal manner, but rather in a centrifugal way. Hence, the pulse of such power directed its concern primarily to ensure the survival of the population, and gradually developed a pulse to optimize the productive forces of life via its politicization. Such illustration is how we would like to contextualize the following discussions that describes politics as defined by Foucault as the power over life, suggesting a way of governing that considers the lives of people that requires a systematic calculation. However, what we would like to describe here is the reifying tendency of such positivist orientation of calculating the forces of life as a form of control. In a separate paper or section, this is where we explore the affinity of Foucault with the assumptions raised by the first generation thinkers of critical theory, particularly that of Adorno. What both thinkers share is the way such thinking or rationality carries the same pathological epistemic orientation, wherein human life is unreflectively captured and dominated by a metric fixated approach of governing. This underscores that the conflation of a scientific reflection on life as a political question seeking to address the survival of the population also results to an obverse reality. Yet no matter how politics or politicians claim its approach as scientific, something remains amiss in such hubris. Thus, such tendency strategically hides the underlying principle of any given state's battle in today's social milieu. To highlight the quote coming from Foucault, this is the exercise of politics that has to be capable of killing in order to go on living. The production of a form of life includes an outcome that also kills life, not simply in the name of the sovereign, but in the name of the population. Both Agamben and Mbembe highlight this principle in their separate works from Foucault's biopolitics. In contrast, however, the former's description emerged from the experience of how democracies apply the principle of a state of exception, where unwanted individuals perceived as threats to the population are reduced to bare life. Mbembe, on the other hand, adds a layer of articulation derived from the experience that is common to us, and that is of colonial rule that extends its analysis to current forms of subtle coloniality. Furthermore, my reading suggests that Mbembe's ideas of necropolitics emphasizes how the force of killing involves a method of extraction and not simply the imposition of force. Before I proceed to a discussion of how or we would weave this to the present realities in the Philippines during this pandemic, we would like to note one crucial passage in Foucault's text, and it reads, "One of the characteristic privileges of sovereign power was the right to decide life. It is derived from the ancient Patria Potestas that granted the father of the Roman family the right to dispose of the life of his children and his slaves. Just as he given them life, so he could take it away." End of quote. The following passage in the last chapter of The History of Sexuality is Foucault's description on how power is exercised in the hands of the sovereign, a force where life is seized and dispensed with based on the wish of the ruler. What is delineated in the discussions is the contrast of the sovereign power with that of biopower. It describes a shift from a sovereign power where authority is exercised via a juridical practice that imposes the limitations of a law or a rule to the corporeal aspects of life. On the other hand, biopolitics functions through norms rather than laws that accesses the body through strategies such as discipline, succinctly captured in the phrase, "the soul is the prison of the body." This subtle intervention on human life was later on extended to another principle coined by Foucault as governmentality, or the conduct of conduct. Both strategies can be viewed as ontologies of power, where the exercise of the former focuses on the regimentation of bodies via an internalization of the norm, whereas the latter, referring to governmentality, involves a process that can be understood as an exercise of power where individuals self-govern themselves via value-oriented formations that creates a ripple effect on bodies. In fact, it may be described as a form of affect, where such value internalization translates to normalized perceptions and behaviors that effectively shape the docile and obedient citizen. The above-mentioned quote and its corresponding description place a significant insights well suited to our current situation. Perceived not only as a messianic leader who will bring the Philippines into a picture of a future hoped by many, the safe environment free from criminals, and a clean government devoid of any nepotism, leading the entire country to progress. President Rodrigo Duterte surprised the group of traditional politicians in the landscape of Philippine politics in 2016. Furthermore, the one reality in Philippine politics that I would like to emphasize is on how language plays an important role in capturing the hearts and minds of the people that in return create the necessary loyalist subject. If the former president Joseph Ejercito Estrada is often referred to as the champion of the poor, in Tagalog, Erap para sa mahirap, or Erap for the poor, the current regime, resonating or echoing the quote of Foucault, gained power that appealed to people of all social class, because it is a discourse where Duterte emphasized or was emphasized as a father figure. You will see, for example, in the news that he is often referred to as tatay or father. Hence, the unwavering support and faith of his loyalists were held captive by a master who only acts for the best interests of the nation, and the nation is considered as his family. The disruption of life's normal pattern under the current global pandemic raised a deep existential concern and ethical import in our lives. Coming from the realities of the global South, what can, however, be observed is not the elimination of the Hobbesian model of sovereign powers force present in Foucault's juxtaposition, but rather its return in the plateau of the social and political spectrum. Hence, contrary to the call of cutting the king's head, what emerges as a concern is the perception that such political vision is not as successful as hoped in Philippine democracy. Rather, its force continues to work its way in the institutions of the state, albeit in a masked fashion through normalizations of conduct and perception. The exercise of power over life by the state and its apparatus has intensified in terms of governing people, subjects considered as an iota of the whole population where the rule of the sovereign reigns. The justification of this control finds its base of support due to the uncertainties of the current pandemic, where policies governing people is often referred to as the new normal. Hence, the control over life is not solely a biological concern. Instead, it is intended to be a political question as well. From building life to communities of death to living life in communities of death, stories of struggle from the Philippine realities. It is the Hobbesian logic of power that continues to oscillate in our present times. That is to say, the mutual relation between protection and obedience, on which modern sovereignty is founded. The lingering question, however, among Filipinos is that to what extent should the security of the population from the threat of an invisible virus requires only a one-dimensional system of obedience? This is not to say that certain restrictions should be in place. Rather, what we want to point as the question, more importantly, is what should follow from the contract of obedience normalized via a militaristic approach of surveillance. We could recall that during the inception of the pandemic in 2020, the term new normal is a buzzword to justify almost anything as a normal condition under non-normal circumstances. Like Agamben's experience of the pandemic, the Philippines initiated a crusade to secure the population from the invisible threat of the virus that kept everyone on lockdown. The difference, however, is that the Philippine population were ensnared and kept in their private homes without a clear blueprint as to what comes next. A scenario reminiscent of Foucault's description of the plague-stricken town, where movement is restricted to specific spaces, bodies regimented into timetables, and provisions only come to a select few. Philippine democratic life collapses even more during the pandemic when human rights violations continue to increase exponentially. With the recent case of Sonia Gregorio, as much as I want to show the video, it will be too graphic, but if you can actually search that in YouTube. The name is Sonia Gregorio. The story of it is that Sonia Gregorio and her son were shot by a police officer with her own daughter, who witnessed the horrific crime that went viral in December 2020. Perhaps what is even more shocking in that video is how you may observe that the daughter is somewhat desensitized by the normalcy of abuses of authority that is often manifested in their show of force and violence. What is perhaps more heartbreaking are the scenarios in the hospitals reach their full capacity for incoming COVID-19 patients. As a result, individuals infected with the virus are asked to treat themselves at home, the same space they share with their families. In some cases, even deaths that are not COVID related are declared COVID cases. An escape from the threat of this virus has a price that not everyone can afford. Hence, the subject experiences two possible forms of death, a physical and a psychological one. This scenario becomes even more visceral when the discussion of social class is brought to the fore. The unemployed and the underemployed have to sacrifice their lives by means of a constant vigilance to stay uninfected as they realize the cost of getting infected, or to experience a life without treatment where the possibility of either life or death is faced squarely by oneself with much uncertainty. Just a concluding note, what I call visions of utopia from the thoughts of dystopia. The scenarios just described together with their theoretical, I want to highlight this important point because the often cited criticism against Foucault is that most of his works do not have a normative foundation or normative basis. But this is where this is the reason why we went to Adorno, providing that possibility that may somehow give Foucault that normative requirement. And this is coming from Andrea Rossi. The scenarios just described, together with their theoretical articulations, is where the normative question of what can be different. It is from the wrong state of things, as Adorno put it, is where hope is inscribed in any vision of utopia. As both thinkers agree, hope emerges from the act of critique about the history of the present. As Andrea Rossi suggests in her reading of Foucault, critique and genealogy co-arise. In their co-arising, they define each other. There is neither critique nor genealogy. There is only a form of genealogical critique whose nature targets modes of operation and tactics are historically driven and ethically driven. End of quote. And thank you very much. And I think Hadje will be able to provide some examples and shed light to the discussion as well. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Now, the same procedure, the one who wants to ask something, type your name in the chat, please. Okay, Dan, you can start.
Hi, thank you, and thanks for your paper. I feel compelled to action as someone who's used Foucault to think with quite a lot. And just to sort of comment on your that kind of final, the genealogical critique. I mean, my take on that, for what it's worth, and I'm interested to know kind of quite why you've, one question to you is quite why you feel the need to provide a normative ground. I mean, surely a Foucauldian response would be to say, well, you know, you can create a normative ground, but actually we can subject that to a genealogical criticism. And I mean, I think this reflects back also to the comment earlier, that reference to Marx's 18th Brumaire, where Marx famously says, you know, man creates his own history, but not in conditions of his own choosing. So surely that observation on genealogical critique is doing something similar. It's saying, you know, that, and the difference between critique and genealogy, I would think, is that critique is bound up in a metaphysical, philosophical argument, in a way that Nietzsche and then Foucault's genealogies attempt to escape from. Then you can ask the question, well, do they actually escape? Or, you know, are we stuck with you know, still having a kind of phantasm? Is utopian kind of thinking precisely an iteration of that kind of phantasm of a moment beyond space and time in the present? But so I'm interested in why you think we need a kind of normative ground. No one can, I mean, my challenge would be to say, well, no one can give you a kind of theoretical argument for why you should fight. Yeah, and you look in vain for a theoretical argument as to why you should fight. And then the second would be, isn't there something of a kind of an oxymoron in the idea of a genealogical critique? Because it might be genealogical criticism rather than genealogical critique. Genealogical critique suggests that we're still hooked up to the kind of metaphysical moment.
Okay. Thank you, Sam, for that insightful comment. To be honest, it's actually a challenge for me on how to navigate this question that I often receive from my colleagues in the university. And the question always arises that, you know, it describes that Foucauldian approach as lacking any sense of normativity. But I often respond in that fashion. And somehow I read this book by Deborah Cook, where she articulates that critique is a normative approach already in itself. And the reason why the pressure against a Foucauldian approach to provide a Foucauldian, the pressure to provide a Foucauldian normativity is something that I see that is not entirely necessary, because in the first place, reading Foucault, he never, you know, required a universal concept of normativity. And I think this really informed our research because it allows us to provide our research with a decolonialized perspective that maybe probably we can get that resource of normativity from, you know, our colonial past. And that's something that is very insightful from Foucault's perspective, that we get to uncover subjugated knowledges, including knowledges of normativity. And I thank Hadje for sharing those concepts of decoloniality, which I'm currently initially exploring. And one of the things that, one of the works that I'm actually exploring in present times is the works of Migdolo and that of Mbembe, because Mbembe somehow touches, or not somehow, but touches that framework of biopolitics. But he situated biopolitics in the experience of coloniality, which is where we find an affinity with. Yes.
Okay, if no one else has a question, I have a question. And it's a rather practical one, but as you were speaking about Duterte creating this some kind of narrative of he being the father of the nation, how did it change with the military now being so aggressive? Because I feel like the narrative doesn't hold anymore, because a father doesn't need soldiers to sort of educate his children. So was there some kind of a change? Did it somehow unite the community? Did it unite the nation to see something different, or did it just like make the differences between people larger?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. how I'm going to respond to that will be informed by our observations in our social and political milieu. Starting in 2016, what Duterte did is, of course, to, the reason why he won the election, the way that I view it, is because he acknowledged all, or he said yes to all people coming from all directions, the left, and what eventually happened is when he came to the seat of power, he polarized the Philippine social and political landscape to the point that those who are not subscribing to his ideas or his will really gets, bashed in social media. And even now, there are reports of not only people who are getting killed because of his campaign on drug against war, but the elections is coming up. It's only a matter of a year, and you will observe that certain people from the oppositions, okay, not known ones, but oppositions nonetheless, are systematically being eradicated. But to answer one of the questions that you raised, is that Duterte managed to create loyalists in the military. And what he is actually doing now is, aside from the military, he's actually assigning his people, young ones, in the Supreme Court. And this is a really precarious situation, and how the Philippine social and political landscape are going to be shaped. And a lot of interesting things will emerge later on. And I think Hadje wants to provide more insights.
Also, he appointed several former generals, military generals, to the public office. So that's how he gained the trust and loyalty of the military institutions, including institution.
Okay, thank you very much. And the last question will be from Vladimir, and then we'll finish.
Thank you so kindly. This was a really cool presentation. Although my question is more of a comment / question, something in the similar regard. So, couple of, if not this year or last year, I can't really remember. He had a comment about his legacy as a president. So the interesting thing was the questionnaires that were being done throughout the Philippines on who would you like to be a president after he steps down, and a lot of data pointed towards his daughter. I think her name was Sarah, if I'm not mistaken, something like that. So. Having said that, I mean, the ideology is so very well intertwined within one social structure that you can't really see beyond the horizon of one ruling political party / political family. So that's something really interesting to note.
Hadje, you want to take this one?
You can okay. Give first.
Yeah. Anyway, thank you for that question. The thing is, when it comes to surveys, there is now this emerging feeling that somehow it's a form of conditioning the population, that there is no way that anyone can actually oppose the family of Duterte. But setting aside those surveys, there are emerging sentiments coming even from his former colleagues coming from his former people or identified people who are actually seated in the Senate, in the Congress, who are actually now turning the other way around. But the crucial thing that he did here, which is would most probably win another regime under Duterte, is how he solidified the vote in the South. When I say South, of course, we're pretending of the Philippines being constituted by three regions. Of course, we have Luzon. In the middle, we have Visayas, and in the south, we have Mindanao. Most of the developments are actually trickling down there, which also provided people the view that there's progress here, and we will identify to be loyal with the family. I'm not sure now whether it's the same with a former political affiliate coming from the north, who is also, itching to get back in power. We're referring, of course, to the Marcoses. What I observed, because what we did is we went to the Facebook pages of Duterte loyalists, or often referred to as DDS, diehard Duterte followers, is that we will observe before that those who are loyal to the Marcoses are also loyal to the Dutertes. But what is interesting now, the narrative that and the discourse that is prevalent now is that there are a lot of sentiments from the Marcos loyalists that are quite critical of the Duterte regime. So I'm not sure about the constitution of the North in terms of being loyal to this campaign of another Duterte. They often call, they're now calling it, we prefer continuity, Duterte for president. That's how they labeled it. Yes, Hadje.
Yes, I think I agree with you totally. This is how President Duterte solidify and preparing the road for his daughter to replace him in power. Of course, there's also a massive support for the narrative from the religious groups, the religious fundamentalist groups, also to some political opportunists to support him because of due to their political interest. And I think, but now I think it's become more, it's like a volcano now. We cannot actually, to be honest, it's very, very fragile now, the Duterte's administration, due to his failure of how they responded to the pandemic, and also to their foreign policy toward China and the Philippine West Philippine Sea, South China Sea disputes. So I think I hope that the Filipino will perhaps later realize that it's only the government is only using the narratives of he's a very concrete example of a populist, a modern form of populist, using some religious rhetorics and exploit the despair, the hope and despairs of the Filipino people.
Thank you so kindly.
Thank you very much for your presentation once again. And I thank all the speakers and all the participants. And in 1 hour and a half, we'll meet here again to continue with our next session. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Diana.
Thank you, Diana. Thank you, Patrick.
Thank you.
Thank you, Patrick.
Thank you.